On a cold morning in May 1945, in a small village in the Sudetenland, a group of exhausted Jewish prisoners wake up to a sound they have not heard in years. Silence. No barking orders in German, no boots on gravel, no shouted roll call. They step cautiously out of their barracks and look around the yard. The watchtowers are empty, the SS guards are gone, the factory machines are quiet. In the distance, they can hear the rumble of artillery that does not belong to the Wehrmacht. They realize something almost unbelievable. They have survived. There are about 1,200 of them, men and women who should, by all logic of the Nazi system, already be dead. Men and women whose names appeared on a typewritten list that at first glance looked like just another bureaucratic document of the Third Reich. We know it today by another name, Schindler's List. The man who created that list is not with them anymore. He has slipped away in the night, heading west, trying to stay ahead of the Red Army and the Allied authorities who might see only the uniform he once wore, not the lives he saved. His name is Oskar Schindler. Most people today know him from a black-and-white Hollywood film, but his real story is more complicated, more unsettling, and more revealing, not just about the Third Reich, but about the world that came after, the world of the Cold War, where Soviet regimes expropriated his factories and buried his memory for decades. To understand why his story still matters and why it fascinated Americans watching the Cold War unfold, you have to start long before those 1,200 people woke up free in Brinlitz. You have to go back to the 1930s, to another part of Central Europe, on the eve of catastrophe. Oskar Schindler was born in 1908 in the town of Zwittau in Moravia, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He grew up in a German-speaking family that owned a small agricultural machinery business. He was not a saint, and he was not a hero. He was, by most accounts, a charming, impulsive, ambitious young man who liked fast motorcycles, good wine, and the company of friends. In the 1920s and early 1930s, the world around him changed. The Austro-Hungarian Empire vanished. New borders cut across old maps. Zwittau became part of the new state of Czechoslovakia, and ethnic Germans like the Schindlers found themselves minorities in someone else's country. The Great Depression hit. His father's business faltered and failed. Oskar drifted from job to job, salesman, mechanic, businessman. He got married, gambled, drank, and kept chasing opportunities. In this environment, he gravitated toward the Sudeten German Party, a nationalist movement that promised to restore German pride in Czechoslovakia's borderlands. That party, in turn, grew closer and closer to Adolf Hitler's Germany. For a man like Schindler, bilingual, well-connected, eager to curry favor with powerful people, the German military intelligence service, the Abwehr, offered a tempting path. He became an agent. In the mid-1930s, under the code name Oskar Schindler, he gathered information on Czechoslovakian railroads, bridges, and military installations. He reported on troop movements. He helped prepare the ground for Hitler's expansion. In July 1938, the Czechoslovakian authorities caught him. He was arrested and charged with espionage. For a few months, it looked like he might be headed for a long prison term. Then the Munich Agreement happened. Britain and France, hoping to avoid war, pressured Prague into handing over the Sudetenland to Germany. The border shifted again. The Nazi flag flew over Zwittau. Oskar Schindler was released as a political prisoner. Within months, he joined the Nazi Party. He was promoted within the Abwehr. By 1939, he was a loyal cog in Hitler's machine, stationed in Ostrava near the Polish border. He had gone from small-town businessman to official of a growing empire. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, Schindler followed the tide of opportunity into the newly occupied territories. Poland was carved up. The western parts were incorporated into the Reich. The central area became the general government, run by a Nazi civilian administration. It was there, in the city of Krakow, that Schindler saw a chance to make his fortune. He arrived in a place where the rules were being rewritten at gunpoint. Polish businesses were being seized. Jewish shops were being Aryanized, handed over to German administrators for pennies or confiscated outright. The Nazi state wanted to mobilize the economy for war, and it needed men willing to take over. Schindler was exactly that kind of man. In late 1939, he took control of a small enamelware factory in the Zablocki district of Krakow, previously owned by Jewish businessmen. With backing from German investors and political connections, he turned it into Deutsche Emaillenwaren Factory, DEF, known as Emalia. Officially, Emalia produced enamel cookware for the civilian market, and increasingly for the Wehrmacht. Pots, pans, mess kits. In the logic of wartime Germany, that made it important. At first, Schindler ran Emalia like any other war profiteer. He hired ethnic Polish workers and, crucially, Jewish workers from the Krakow ghetto. Jews were cheaper. Their wages went largely to the SS. They were forced laborers, kept under threat of punishment or death. Schindler dressed in tailored suits, drove a luxury car, smoked expensive cigarettes. He cultivated friendships with local Nazi officials, especially with officers in the SS and the party boss of Krakow. He threw lavish parties. He bribed everyone who mattered. His Jewish workers, many of whom had lost homes and businesses, saw in him a complex figure, a charismatic German who drank and joked with the people who had destroyed their lives, but who also, importantly, kept them employed. And in the Nazi system, employment could mean survival. In 1940 and 1941, life for Jews in Krakow grew steadily worse. They were confined to a ghetto. They lost the right to own businesses. They faced curfews, humiliations, random beatings. To get out of the ghetto each day and walk to Emalia under guard was not freedom, but it was a thin line of relative safety compared to those who had no work permit at all. By 1942, the line between life and death sharpened. The Nazis began implementing the final solution. Transports left Krakow for extermination camps like Belzec and Auschwitz. Families disappeared, streets emptied. Soldiers with dogs and guns became a daily presence. Schindler watched this up close. He saw his workers vanish when they lost their permits. He heard rumors, he saw trains, he saw the camps. In March 1943, the Krakow ghetto was liquidated. SS units stormed in. Those deemed fit for work were sent to a new concentration camp being built on the outskirts, called Plaszow. The rest, the elderly, the sick, children, many women, were shot or deported to death camps. Plaszow was run by Eamon Goeth, an Austrian SS officer whose cruelty would later become infamous. Schindler's factory now drew its Jewish workforce from this new camp. His workers no longer went home at night. They were marched from Plaszow to Emalia in the morning and back in the evening, surrounded by guards. They lived in barracks under Goeth's guns. From his vantage point as a well-connected German industrialist, Schindler had a unique view. He could see how arbitrary violence had become. He could see that Jews were being killed not as a byproduct of war, but as a policy. It was around this time, 1942, 1943, that something shifted inside him. Historians debate his motives. Some point to specific incidents, a massacre he witnessed, the killing of a child, the fate of a particular family. Others emphasized the cumulative effect, the slow erosion of excuses, the moment when you can no longer pretend you do not know. Whatever the exact trigger, the results are clear. Schindler began to change how he used his position. He stopped thinking only of profit and started thinking of protection. He realized that, in the twisted logic of the Nazi system, there was one status that could keep Jews alive longer: being essential workers for the war effort, with a German industrialist willing to vouch for them. So he took advantage of that logic. He expanded his workforce of Jews even when it did not make perfect business sense. He exaggerated the skill level needed for certain jobs, arguing that specific individuals were irreplaceable specialists. He bribed camp officers and bureaucrats to assign particular prisoners to Amalia. He insisted that his Jewish workers be housed in a subcamp attached to his factory, instead of in the main part of Plaszow. That subcamp, built at his own expense, had barracks just outside the factory gates. Conditions there were still harsh. It was still a camp. There were still guards. People still got sick and died. But it was not Plaszow. In Plaszow, Eamon Goeth could stand on his balcony, pick a man or woman at random, and shoot them for sport. In Schindler's compound, he had to respect, at least on paper, the fact that these prisoners belonged to a factory classified as important for the war effort. Schindler leaned into that difference. He smuggled extra food into the camp. He arranged for better clothing and shoes. He tolerated and even quietly supported religious observances. When his workers fell ill, he argued with the SS to keep them off transport lists. Every one of these acts cost him something: money, time, political capital, personal safety. He funded them by playing the role the Nazis expected of him. He drank with officers, he gave them gifts, he hosted parties, he made himself useful. He built a persona: Oskar Schindler, bon vivant, loyal German, reliable supplier, one of us. Behind that mask, he was building something very different: a shield of paper and influence around 1,000 human beings. By 1944, the war was turning against Germany. The Red Army was advancing from the east. The Western Allies had landed in Normandy. The Nazi leadership was ordering the closure of camps near the front, the liquidation of prisoners, the destruction of evidence. Plaszow was on the list. As the SS prepared to empty it, Jews were being sent to Auschwitz and other camps deeper in the Reich. The odds of survival plummeted. Schindler understood what that meant for his workers. If they stayed in Plaszow or in Krakow, they would be swept up by the machinery of death. He decided to move first. He proposed to the authorities that he relocate his factory to a safer location in the Sudetenland, now firmly within Germany's pre-war borders, in a place called Brünnlitz, near his home region. On paper, it was a sensible business move. Allied bombing was intensifying. Moving production inland made strategic sense. The new factory would produce ammunition shells and anti-tank components, critical for the war effort. Schindler played the role of the patriot industrialist. He lobbied in Berlin, he filled out forms, he made promises, he bribed. There was one condition: he needed to take his Jewish skilled workers. Not just a handful, not just a few foremen, all of them. Together with his Jewish accountant and right hand, Itzhak Stern, and others like Mitek Pemper, Schindler compiled lists of names from his existing workforce and from among other prisoners in Plaszow who might be protected under the cover of factory labor. Men and women, skilled and unskilled, old and young. By the time he was done, the lists contained around 1,100 to 1,200 names. For the SS, these were numbers on forms. For the people carrying those numbers tattooed or sewn into their clothes, they were life and death. The SS approved the transfer. In October 1944, the men designated for Brünnlitz were loaded into cattle cars and sent west. The journey was hellish, but they arrived at the new factory camp. The women's transport, however, took a different route. Instead of going directly to Brünnlitz, the train carrying the women was diverted to Auschwitz. For 2 weeks, they were trapped in the most infamous death camp of all, surrounded by chimneys, smoke, and selections. Schindler discovered this only after arriving in Brunlitz and finding that half of those on his list had not shown up. He knew exactly what Auschwitz meant. He went there. No one just went to Auschwitz in 1944. It was a place designed to swallow people forever. But Schindler, armed with letters of authorization, a plausible story about production, and a briefcase full of valuables, walked into the administrative offices of the camp. He argued that the women on his list were essential to his factory. He insisted they had been sent there by mistake. He offered bribes, money, diamonds, whatever he had left. It worked. After 2 weeks of terror, the women from his list were put back on a train and sent to Brunlitz. If he had been slower, if the paperwork had been delayed, if the wrong officer had been on duty, they would have gone up the chimney, as prisoners said. Instead, they arrived at a factory where for the next several months, the priority was not production, but survival. At Brunlitz, Schindler's operation took on an even more surreal character. Officially, it was a munitions factory, producing anti-tank shells. In reality, very little ammunition ever left the place in usable condition. Many shells were deliberately made defective, gauges were miscalibrated, machines malfunctioned, whole batches failed quality checks, sabotage became policy. While German engineers and inspectors wondered why the output was so poor, Schindler focused on feeding his workers, keeping them warm, and keeping the SS at bay. He smuggled in extra food, often at high prices, bartering on the black market. He bribed guards to look the other way when people stole scraps. His wife, Emilie, set up an infirmary to care for the sick. He spent his money as fast as he could get it, buying safety one day at a time. And then, in the spring of 1945, the Third Reich collapsed. As the Red Army marched in from the east, the SS guards at Brunlitz prepared to abandon the camp. There were standard orders, in many places, to kill prisoners rather than let them be freed. Whether such orders were formally given at Brunlitz is debated, but Schindler and his team took no chances. He gathered the guards and, according to survivor accounts, addressed them directly. He pointed out that the war was lost, that any acts of mass murder now would be pointless and would only make things worse for them when they faced Allied justice. He ensured they would leave quietly. Then he told his workers that they were free. He gave them the few valuables he had left to help them survive the first days on their own. And then he left. To the Red Army, marching in from the east, any German industrialist in charge of a camp attached to Grossrosen looked like a war criminal. To partisans and survivors, any man who had worn a Nazi pin looked like a target. Schindler knew that. In the weeks after the war, he and Emilie traveled west, slipping through a crumbling Germany divided into occupation zones. He carried with him letters from the Jews he had saved, describing what he had done. Those letters, along with their testimony, would later protect him from jail. But they could not protect his property. In the new Europe that emerged from the ruins, lines were drawn again. Zwickau became Svitavy, part of Czechoslovakia. Brunlitz went back to being Brunetz. Krakow and Zablottie became part of a Poland now under communist control. The factories where Schindler had made his wartime fortune were nationalized by the new regimes. Nazi-owned property was confiscated. German businesses in the East were taken over by socialist governments. The logic was simple: expropriate the expropriators. Nobody in Prague, Warsaw, or East Berlin was interested in compensating a former Nazi party member, however many Jews he had saved. Schindler's assets vanished behind the Iron Curtain. He emerged from the war with his life, his wife, and a stack of letters. Nothing more. In the late 1940s, he settled in the western zones of the then soon-to-become Federal Republic, West Germany. He faced a country undergoing denazification, reconstruction, and a massive identity crisis. He tried to start businesses. He failed. He tried again. He failed again. He lacked capital. He lacked the skills to compete in the new, regulated, monitored environment. His talent for networking with Nazi officials did not translate well into the emerging West German business world, where Allied oversight and new laws made pure cronyism more difficult. In 1948, he went before denazification courts. Former prisoners testified on his behalf. They told judges that this man had saved their lives. They described the subcamp at Emaille, the transfer to Brunlitz, the rescue from Auschwitz. The courts classified him not as a major offender, but as someone who had assisted victims. He avoided prison. Legally, his record was cleared enough for him to remain in West Germany. Financially, he remained near broke. The Cold War was beginning. On one side, the Soviet Union and its satellites were building Stalinist economies, repressing dissent, and telling their own story about the war, one in which communist partisans, not complex figures like Schindler, were the heroes. On the other, the United States and Western Europe were rebuilding through the Marshall Plan, laying the foundations for economic miracles, a consumer society, and a wave of technological innovation. Schindler's life, however, did not fit neatly into the grand narratives of either side. In the East, communist regimes saw him as a capitalist entrepreneur, a man who owned factories and exploited workers. His Nazi party membership and Abwehr past made him undesirable. The fact that he had saved Jews did not fit easily into the official propaganda, which tended to downplay Jewish pfeffering in favor of a generic anti-fascist resistance. In the West, he was one story among many in a world trying to distance itself from the horrors of the past and focus on refrigerators, cars, and televisions. In 1992, helped by donations from some of the Jews he had saved, Oskar and Emilie Schindler emigrated to Argentina. Argentina, under Juan Perón, had become a destination for many Germans after the war, some criminals, some refugees, some just looking for a new start. For Schindler, it was supposed to be a fresh beginning. He bought land and tried to run a farm, raising chickens and, at one point, ostriches. He had no real experience in agriculture on that scale. He made poor business decisions. The farm failed. He tried other ventures. They failed too. By the mid-1950s, he was deeply in debt. In 1958, he returned alone to West Germany. Emilie stayed in Argentina, effectively ending their marriage in all but name. Back in Germany, he lived in a small apartment in Frankfurt, then in other cities. He was no longer an industrialist. He was a man living largely on stipends and donations from the people he had once employed as slave laborers. Many of his Schindler Jews had resettled in Israel. They had started new lives, built families, opened businesses, joined the new state's army and institutions. They did not forget him. They organized collections to support him. When he visited Israel, they welcomed him like a father. They took him into their homes. They called him our Oskar. They also began to work on preserving the memory of what he had done. In 1962, Yad Vashem, Israel's official Holocaust memorial, recognized Oskar and Emilie Schindler as the righteous among the nations, an honor reserved for non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. He planted a tree on the Avenue of the Righteous in Jerusalem. He was one of the very few former Nazi Party members to receive that honor. Yet, even as he was honored in Israel and supported by survivors, he remained marginal in the broader global consciousness. The Western world in the 1960s and 1970s was preoccupied with new conflicts: the Vietnam War, civil rights struggles, the Cuban Missile Crisis, astronauts walking on the moon, and computers starting to appear in labs and businesses. The Cold War narrative focused on the superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Stories about individual Germans from the war, especially ones who didn't fit neatly into categories of villain or saint, did not get much airtime. Behind the Iron Curtain, in the communist states that now controlled Krakow, Brunlitz, and Zwickau, Schindler's story remained mostly out of sight. The factories he had owned were now state enterprises. The subcamp sites were folded into broader narratives about Nazi crimes and proletarian suffering. The regimes in Warsaw and Prague had little incentive to highlight the story of a capitalist industrialist who had saved Jews through private initiative, bribery, and personal networks, especially not when that story might remind people that there had been moral gray zones in a system they preferred to portray as a simple struggle of fascists versus heroic communists. Oskar Schindler died in 1974 in Hildesheim, West Germany, after years of health problems, including alcoholism. He was 66 years old. According to his wishes, he was buried in Jerusalem, on Mount Zion, in a Catholic cemetery. His grave overlooks the Old City, a long way from the Sudeten Hills where he was born and from the communist states that had swallowed his factories. There is an inscription on the tombstone in German and Hebrew, the unforgettable lifesaver of 1,200 persecuted Jews. Only in the years after his death did his story begin to reach a mass audience. In 1982, an Australian novelist named Thomas Keneally published Schindler's Ark, a work of non-fiction novel based on extensive interviews with Schindlerjuden. It turned scattered memories and archival fragments into a compelling narrative. In the early 1990s, at the dawn of the post-Cold War era, American director Steven Spielberg read the book and decided to make a film. Schindler's List, released in 1993, was shot mostly in black and white. It focused on Krakow, Plaszow, and Brünlitz. It showed Schindler as a flawed man who drinks, cheats, and jokes with Nazis, but who gradually risks everything to save people who, in the Nazi racial order, were supposed to die. For American audiences, especially those who had grown up during the Cold War, the film did something else too. It reminded them that the fight against totalitarianism did not begin and end with missile silos and proxy wars. It reminded them that courage and corruption, opportunity and redemption all coexisted inside one man. It also highlighted, indirectly, a contrast that had defined the second half of the 20th century. The Nazi regime had tried to use technology and bureaucracy to exterminate a people. It built camps, gas chambers, crematoria, it kept records, it applied a grotesque, perverted rationality to murder. After the war, Soviet regimes in Eastern Europe tried to use technology and bureaucracy to control memory. They controlled printing presses, radio transmitters, typewriters. They monitored photocopiers. They decided which stories could be told and which would be forgotten. In the West, meanwhile, the United States and its allies unleashed a different kind of technological wave. Television, mass-market paperbacks, photocopiers, eventually videotapes, and the early internet. A story like Schindler's, once told, could spread. Holocaust survivors could publish memoirs in New York and Los Angeles, not just in secret in Warsaw or Prague. Directors in Hollywood could shoot films on location in Krakow with permission from post-communist governments eager to reconnect with the broader world. The same technological and media environment that had carried radio-free Europe into the Eastern Bloc during the Cold War now carried the story of Schindler back to the places where it had happened, over the heads of the censors who once would have tried to block it. For decades, behind the Iron Curtain, Schindler's factories were just factories. His name was absent from textbooks. His list was a memory in the minds of the people he saved. In the 1990s, after the fall of communism, Poland and the Czech Republic opened archives, renovated sites, and created museums. The Emalia factory in Krakow became a historical museum dedicated partly to Oskar Schindler and partly to the broader story of the city under Nazi occupation. Brünlitz, the site of Brünlitz, has remnants of the camp and factory that are now the subject of preservation efforts. Svitavi, acknowledged its most controversial son. In this way, Schindler's life became a bridge between two eras of oppression, Nazi and communist.
He began his adult life as a collaborator with a regime that worshipped power and technology, that believed bureaucratic efficiency could be used to redesign entire populations. He used that regime's tools for his own advantage. Then, confronted with the reality of genocide, he turned those tools against it as best he could. After the war, he lost everything to a new set of regimes that claimed to represent justice but practiced their own form of expropriation and suppression of truth. He died poor in a capitalist country that had moved on to newer fears and newer enemies, his story known intimately only to the people whose names were once typed on a list as skilled workers. For Americans, especially those interested in the Cold War, his story resonates on multiple levels. It shows how individuals can use systems designed for evil to do good. It shows how authoritarian regimes, whether Nazi or communist, fear not only weapons but also uncontrolled stories. It shows how, in the end, the technological and cultural openness of the West made it possible to recover and share a truth that had been buried on both sides of the Iron Curtain. When you watch Schindler's List today, you are not just watching a story about the 1940s, you are watching the product of a world in which an American director could travel freely to a former communist city, use advanced cameras, sound, and special effects, and beam that story into millions of homes via tape, DVD, streaming, and more. You are watching a story that the Nazi censors of 1943 and the communist censors of 1963 would both have tried to suppress, and failed eventually because they could not keep up with the spread of information in a world where the free flow of ideas, backed by powerful technology, favored open societies. Oskar Schindler did not live to see that. He did not see the fall of the Berlin Wall. He did not see the opening of archives in Warsaw. He did not see tourists lining up outside his old enamelware factory, now a museum. He did not see his life portrayed in Dolby surround sound in theaters across America. He died believing, by many accounts, that he had done less than he could have done. He once reportedly said that he could have saved more if he had sold his car, his ring, his last possessions. The people whose children and grandchildren live today because of his decisions might disagree. They know that in a world where industrial technology and totalitarian ideology combined to kill on an unprecedented scale, one man used those same systems, factory rosters, production quotas, train schedules, bureaucratic signatures, to pull as many people as he could out of the line. And they know that in the long struggle between open societies and closed regimes, between those who try to hide the past and those who expose it, their existence itself is an answer. It is a living, breathing list. Names that were almost erased, carried across decades of war, dictatorship, and Cold War, brought finally into the light by a global culture that values stories like theirs and that has the technology to tell them to anyone in the world who is willing to listen.